Welcome to Bring the Heat podcast. Today, it's your host, XBrad, and our very, very special guest, Ultima Ratio Regis. How you doing, URR?
I'm doing well. Trying to stay warm in the sub-zero temperatures, but otherwise intact.
You know, we're a bi-coastal blog. URR is in the freezing zone. And over here in Palm Desert, our high today is going to be 90 degrees.
I would appreciate it if you sent me 25 or 30 of those degrees. That would be great.
I'd be happy to share if I could.
Yeah, certainly a Bernie Sanders approach to weather.
You know, a little bit of socialism isn't always bad. So we're going to cover probably two topics at least, maybe three today. URR wants to start off with the big breaking news on the death of Antonin Scalia. So, yeah, it was a bombshell yesterday.
It was one of those, I think, that anybody who is at all right of center or even in the middle dreaded to hear the news of. The Supreme Court has been in a very delicate 5-4 balance now for about the past, since Sotomayor and Elena Kagan were nominated and appointed. I think this has potentially pretty negative import for those who believe in constitutional liberties. And I know you've got some views on that yourself, but I would tell you that the idea of having a strict constitutional constructionist on the court allowed a great deal of the arguments to be couched in the document for which that court was created. Without his voice, without his very cogent, very learned opinions on that court, I've got some fairly grave concerns about what we're going to see, an increasingly partisan liberal influence on that court till the American people is suddenly constitutional.
You know, let me first start by saying, and I love the fact that Scalia was a strict constitutionalist. That's my thing. I'm conservative, but before that, I'm a constitutionalist. I mean, you took an oath, I took an oath. And we didn't, swear fealty to the Republicans. We swore fealty to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And that's one thing I really loved about Justice Scalia. And another thing is, he was just simply brilliant. Read his opinions. The man was very smart and even entertaining to read his opinions. I read opinions by the other justices, and even Clarence Thomas, who I love, couldn't write an opinion half as well as Scalia.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. His work, if you read some of his, particularly when he is the dissenting opinion, and it levels criticism on the decision of the court and why. Some of his legal writings they're simply brilliant. He was one that understood, I think, at a very, very basic level, that the Constitution was not an enumeration of simply the liberties of the people, but it was an enumeration of the limitations of the power of government at any level. And you're right, we swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States, which is to us is quite sacred. It is not to, and this is something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand. It is not an oath to our senior officers or to our service secretaries or elected officials or the law writ large of the American people. None of that. It is an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And that becomes increasingly problematic as we see rather indisputable evidence that the rule of law, for what it is, has begun to move away from the constitutional guarantees of liberty. Scalia was a staunch defender of that, and his voice will be missed a great deal. I know that we talked a little bit yesterday about his opinions in the citizen.
You still with me, Mark? I think I'm.
XBrad, why don't you share with us your views on those subjects regarding Judge Scalia?
Well, like I say, he's a strict constitutionalist. That's my thing. And and I know that the Constitution lays out both the method and the structure of the government, and more importantly, it simply delineates what the government can and cannot do. And the non-originalist arguments of the court have allowed an expansion of the federal government to a vast overreach beyond what the founders saw. And when the Democrats debate in the primary, one of the things I always want a moderator to ask is there any sphere of a private citizen's life that you do not think the federal government should be in? And I know Scalia would have an answer for that. I don't know what Bernie Sanders or Hillary or Rodham Clinton would say.
That's a great point. And the last two justices to be appointed, Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor, are firmly in the Sanders and Clinton camp, in that there seems to be very little that they don't believe government has a right and a responsibility to intercede in the lives of its private citizens. The 20th century tells us what the results of that usually are. I shudder to think that there are enough voters out there that have very little recollection of the 20th century or knowledge of its history, that we will find ourselves with a government with the power, if not quite yet the will to do so. But once the authority is there, the will is generally no more than a generation from following. And that's a particular concern.
It is. I mean, I like my country. I want it to continue to be good and happy. And one of the interesting things that someone mentioned about the electorate today is the under 35 crowd has never seen a good economy. I mean, they're just not familiar with what it's like to live in the Reagan era.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Is they have seen a governmental philosophy where the government tries to make decisions that replicate free market forces rather than what certainly Ronald Reagan believed the government's role was, which was to create conditions in which the free market could flourish. And whenever the government does that, it never does it very well. It always does it rather clumsily, and there are always unintended consequences. You have to look no further than the Enron mark-to-market regulations that the federal government in the wake of the Enron scandal put into place that had an absolutely negative effect on economic well-being and the ability of commerce to take place. I also worry with these voters under 35 and particularly under 30. They have seen an increasingly, and this is on both sides of the aisle to a certain extent, an increasing willingness of both camps to increase government size and scope of responsibility, and particularly scope of authority. I see the surprise on some younger people's faces that when I tell them that, prior to my junior year in high school, there was no such thing as a federal Department of Education. And if I pointed to the graph, like Al Gore seems to point to the global warming graph over a million years, if I pointed to 1979 as the beginning of a data point, certainly the case could be made that the effect of having a federal role in education has been, if not entirely, then overwhelmingly negative. Scores have gone down, competencies have gone down, while costs have gone up. And that is probably an allegory for other areas of government as well. And it becomes a situation where these young people also have never seen totalitarianism in a way that we did. For those of us who are old enough to have remembered the Cold War and remember the Soviet Union and a truly, doctrinaire communist China, although I'm not sure they're quite as far from it as we like to think that they are, and the excesses in Cuba and in the Khmer Rouge, there were object lessons there about limitless government power and the bloodshed that follows like night follows day, the mantra of forced equality. We have people in this country who quite frankly, don't see the problem with such concepts. And certainly they're not going to get those object lessons from a history class at the secondary or higher education level in this country any longer. And that is also something that causes me some concern. And to bring it back around to Scalia, he was obviously an appointee of Ronald Reagan. He ruled in his cases and argued in his cases with that traditional American mistrust of government authority that now seems to have been both educated and propagandized out of a considerable portion of public opinion. And that also, as a voice, will be greatly missed.
It will. Mitch McConnell and others are saying any appointment is dead on arrival until after the election. Do you think they're going to hold that line?
I certainly hope so. And I hope that they have enough guts to do so. I've got my concerns about McConnell and his just how many vertebrae he has. It is constitutionally permissible for the president to appoint an interim. That interim's term ends when the Senate's term ends, and it must be reconfirmed. If I were Justice Roberts in that case, knowing that this was an appointment that would be a changer in a 5-4 balance, I would be loath to handle key issue cases until such time as there was a permanent appointment. I don't know if he will do that either, frankly.
All Supreme Court cases are key issue cases. And I think the Senate's going to go into the pro forma session mode, clear through the election if they have to. And the Democrats are going to shut down everything they can. Which, as a Republican, I'm like, yes, good. Show me we can operate without the government doing something.
Yeah, and that's another interesting side note was it Tacitus that said that the more corrupt the government, the more laws there are? In many, many ways, I am just fine with a do-nothing Congress. They do the minimum of what's expected of a congressional body, and they don't need to make a whole hell of a lot more laws. Codifying this and that to the point where that which is not forbidden is mandatory, that is a tyranny in and of itself as well. We tend to poo-poo the idea that laws, by their very nature, abridge freedom, but but they do. They are diametrically opposed to liberty, and not necessarily entirely badly. There has to be laws. There has to be a lawful society. But it also does not have to be such a series of laws that whether or not you decide to lie in bed, it doesn't really matter because you're a criminal, because lying in bed makes you a criminal, and getting up and making coffee makes you a criminal. And so, do nothing Congress, a pro forma Congress at this point in a contentious body with the minorities in both houses is not necessarily the worst thing that ever happened to a republic.
All right. We did yesterday discuss the one exception we would have to holding off confirmation until after the election. Ted Cruz. If Obama appointed him, I would say yes.
Yeah, I would too. Cruz is very much that Scalia strict constructionist, and I do have my feelings for him for the Oval Office. However, if he was to be the fifth on the Supreme Court, that is center or right center, I would be very happy with that. I think in many cases, Ted Cruz resonates with some of us who call ourselves slightly libertarian, and Cruz has an interesting approach. His first question often, with regards to government action, is this constitutional? And that is a question that has become increasingly foreign to the political debates of today.
And that's what frustrates me so much, is that it should always be the first question.
Yes, it should. And there is that, increasingly in the last 20 years or so, that loss of suspicion of the government as a benevolent entity. The government is the government, as Thomas Paine said in Common Sense. Society in all its forms is a blessing, and government is at best a necessary evil. That remains true. And it's a shame that has gone out of the debate. And I can take this right back to Justice Roberts' decisions regarding the Affordable Care Act. When the Solicitor General was making the argument before the court, the question I would have asked him if I had been the Chief Justice would have been, if this is permissible under the authority of regulation under Article 2, Article 2, where does it stop? And
yes.
The only honest answer that the Solicitor General could have given would have been, it doesn't stop.
What else can you force me to buy?
Absolutely. Once you have, in precedent in government is an incredibly powerful thing. If the government has done it once without significant legal challenge, or with the challenge in a lower court that upholds such a decision, that power becomes more and more cemented as a lawful and legitimate power of government. And it is surprising how many people, who in some cases people who are educated people, miss the point of that. There were some discussions I had a couple of years ago with friends of mine who were increasingly liberal around the Dartmouth campus, no surprise, regarding stop and frisk in New York, in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, and some of the other boroughs of the city. And their objection to stop and frisk was that it was racist. That, the cops are disproportionately stopping and frisking black men, black young teenagers and black men. And I'm sure they might be. And the point I made, which really caused them to sort of look at me funny, but I think maybe a seed of something hit home, was, what happens when it's not? Well, what do you mean? Well, the New York Police Department will have enough lawyers on the case that they could conceivably argue a case that it is not racist if they have certain screening parameters they use. But the issue is not whether or not it's racist. The issue is whether or not the policeman on the street can stop you and frisk you without cause. And the answer to that question lies in the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effect against unreasonable search and seizure shall not be violated. And no warrant shall issue except upon probable cause, particularly describing the places to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That is, the idea of stop and frisk, whatever good comes from that in the immediate is offset in exponentially by giving the police the powers to essentially wipe clean your Fourth Amendment rights. When does that stop? And the answer to that would also be, it does not. That they can do it whenever they think they have probable cause without having to show it in court in the morning.
Well,
and that is
the standard in stop and frisk isn't even probable cause; it's reasonable suspicion.
Well, I believe they treat those two as synonymous. But stop and frisk in the way that the New York Police Department was doing it didn't even have reasonable suspicion as a standard, and that's very problematic. That's extremely problematic.
Well, the problem is reasonable suspicion has been defined down to where the cop just has a canned series of answers to the question. He walked with a certain cadence, things like that he could articulate before the court, and that would justify the stop and frisk under Terry. Terry versus Ohio.
Right.
And to some extent, I think that is constitutionally valid in that it's the least invasive level. All right. They're not coming into your house. They're briefly detaining you. And we have to have some level of law enforcement ability to do that. But
yes, you do.
As you noted, that became the modus operandi of the entire NYPD, where everybody la-di-da-di got stopped. And whether or not they actually had a reasonable suspicion didn't matter. What they had was a series of canned answers to the question when they were brought into court.
Yeah, and that's a due process argument as well, whether or not the court should accept such a thing, and that's in some cases an even more serious problem if such is accepted as probable cause without probable cause actually being made. That's another can to be opened here, which can cause things to go south in a hurry. And I think back to the late 1980s and in 1990. Late 1980s was the renewal of Miranda. I want to say that it was 88. It was a 20-year window for Miranda, and it was 88 that it was renewed. And I may be wrong on that, but I think it is. And particularly where due process has been set aside was in Dick Thornburgh, who was the Attorney General for George Herbert Walker Bush, his expansion of the search and seizure provisions of RICO, in which the government, if there was a drug investigation, the government was given what amounted to dictatorial powers without cause, without redress, nothing. And I think you're seeing that in a lot of the civil forfeiture cases that have come up now, where some Latino guy's driving across the country with his life savings in his glove compartment because he's going to buy a building and start a business. He gets stopped by some cop in Nebraska. He's got $45,000 in his glove compartment, and the cops take the money.
that's notorious on the I-10 through Texas for civil asset forfeiture. And the problem is we've incentivized police departments because they get to hang on to the money.
Absolutely. You make it a profit-making venture, and people are going to do it.
We talk about Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Black Lives Matter. Michael Brown brought about his own death. But here's a small town that generates a third of its government's revenue from police activity.
Yeah, that's
they budget it.
Yeah, there are a number of towns that do.
It's absolutely wrong.
It is. It's something other than the objective enforcement of the law. And there's a lot about Black Lives Matter that I disagree with intensely, but not all of it. Not all of it. The abuses of the government, of which police are an arm, is I think you described it, the weaponization of government against political opponents, has, again, tying it back to Scalia, has begun to be codified. And that's a very grave concern to me. Whereas I think Scalia fought tooth and nail against it, and I think there are a number of members of the Supreme Court at this point who, particularly if the aggrieved party is part of a political opposition or not in the voter bloc, not only couldn't they care less, in some cases they're open supporters of such weaponization, and that's that's tyranny. It may be small tyranny to a point, but it is tyranny, and certainly not within keeping of the Constitution. There's a limitation on government power.
Yeah, I certainly don't. I don't think our founding fathers saw it that way.
No, they certainly did not. And I think increasingly, and it may be that there's a bit of a bright note here. Increasingly, the flouting of such laws by those of the liberal bent, virtually without challenge, without consequence, has sort of sounded a bell of disgust among a significant number of the American people. Now, the media tells you what the media wants to tell you, and they are overwhelmingly liberal. But I think that there is a chord of disgust and disgruntlement with such behaviors. Hillary Clinton with her email scandal. I don't think people think it's not a big deal. I think they know it's a big deal. Things that would send me to prison would cause me to lose my clearance and my job, and probably send me to prison that day for a single instance of it. And she has hundreds of instances. Like my latest post, Al Sharpton walking around with $4.5 million of IRS debt outstanding, yet Cliven Bundy being imprisoned for a disputed $1 million in grazing fees. Those things don't go unnoticed, and I hate to lose Scalia's voice in that, because I think he came down firmly on the side of the rights of the people. So we're at a crossroads here, and I am hoping McConnell can stick to his guns and, under his constitutional authorities, prevent a vote on any appointment until after the presidential election.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see who Obama nominates. I've seen some names tossed around, but we'll see. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the mess in Turkey, Syria, Russia, Saudi Arabia. The news is, among other things, Saudi Arabia is basing fighters in Turkey to conduct anti-ISIS strikes.
Yeah, that's a. Hang on a second.
Sure.
Sorry about that. At a telemarketer. Yeah, the adding to the mix of the Saudi Air Force components is pretty interesting. I don't know if we've got a very good grasp of what the import of that's going to be.
You know, the Saudis are the big dog in the region in terms of Air Force. They've got a very respectable Air Force. And they're also open to committing ground forces. And they've got a respectable ground force in terms of size. Their operations in Yemen have been unimpressive. But still, they're a formidable size, and size matters.
It does. It does. And it will be interesting to see whether Saudi Arabia can also expand to have other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council follow their lead in whole or in part, which would exacerbate matters in some cases even further.
You know, and for the listeners, basically we've got a three-way fight going on. We've got Russia and Syria kind of sort of aligned with Iran. Russia is deeply committed to the preservation of the Assad regime. You've got ISIS, which is deeply committed to ISIS. And then you've got I guess we would describe them as the unaligned forces that are fighting against the Syrian regime, and simultaneously some of those forces are fighting against ISIS, depending on where they are and what influence ISIS has on them.
And that's a very good summation of that. Laid on top of that sort of volatile complexity is the centuries-old rivalry between the Turks and the Russians. In Syria, I don't think it's been a secret that Putin sent signals to the United States as far back as 2010 and 11 that when the Arab Spring began to go down, they were not going to let their ally Assad be swallowed up. Whether that meant covert aid or overt aid, or eventually the commitment of forces, ground and air, and supporting forces, naval forces in the region, any aircraft, air defense capabilities. They were going to do everything they could to keep Assad from going the way of Mubarak and Gaddafi. And I'm not sure our State Department had the wherewithal, and this is Secretary Clinton, and certainly not the White House had the wherewithal to understand what that meant. Now you have a situation on top of the sort of three-way fight in Syria, which ebbs and flows in either of the three directions almost daily. Well, has up until recently. Assad seems to have gotten the upper hand pretty well. Now you have Russian forces occupying Kamishli Air Force Base. Well, it actually had been a civilian airfield, but now is hosting Russian ground attack and fighter units not very far from the Turkish border. With the November shoot down of the Russian airplane by the Turks, tensions are running extremely high between Turkey and Russia. So into this mix of pro-ISIS, pro-Assad, and anti-ISIS, anti-Assad, we have some external players who, between them, there's no love lost, And oh, by the way, one of them's a NATO ally. Um, things are getting dicey indeed. And of course, the United States has provided some token effort in Syria as well. To what end, I really don't know. I'd be interested in your take on all of this. The smart money has the Turks intervening in Syria. It will be an interesting time when, and it's not an if, it's a when, they come in direct contact with Russians. Whether or not they're underneath, Russian aircraft, or they bump into Russian ground forces with air ground forces, or ground forces with their air forces. Interesting times could be had. Thoughts on that?
As you say, the popular opinion is that Turkey is going to intervene into Syria in a major way, probably with ground forces. They can hardly ignore the massive battle going on right on their border. And as you say, they're going to bump into the Russians. The question becomes, is that an Article 5 defense issue under the NATO Charter?
Yeah, that is obviously the question of the day. And as you know, I worked at the Naval War College, and there are a lot of smart thinkers there, and there's a number of lectures about this back in November and December as tensions really ratcheted up over the aircraft. And interested in your opinion on it, but it seems to be the consensus that the Turks will certainly seem to try and make the case, and the rest of NATO won't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
I think that's going to be the outcome. I think they're going to make the argument that unless Russian forces actually enter Turkey, it's not an Article 5 violation. And you can kind of defend that.
Yeah, you certainly can.
Particularly when arguing otherwise means we're starting World War III.
Correct. That's correct. There are some dynamics that go with that as well. There is a distinct, among the EU nations, a distinct perception that the United States' commitment to NATO in the face of Russian aggression is tenuous at best. There is a perception that the United States lacks the will, and after another couple of rounds of military budget cuts will probably lack the means. As you pointed out in one of your posts, in the Western Military District, the Russian Army has reactivated First Guard's tank army. That, as tough as a battalion of the 101st Airborne might be, they're not going to stop First Guard's tank army for very long. Even with a dozen or so fighter planes flying out of an Air Force base in England, it's simply not going to happen.
I will say this. I think the reformation of the First Guards Tank Army is more a political statement than an actual military restructuring. But that's a hell of a message.
I would tell you also, perhaps there's a lot smaller difference between a political statement in Russia and a military one than there is here. I remember the times where the Russians had invaded South Ossetia in Georgia in 2008, and I was working at Dartmouth College at the time. And in the intellectual circles, there was a great deal of running around with hair on fire. And the question that was asked routinely was, why aren't the Russians negotiating? And I pointed out that they are negotiating. Oh, no. Why don't they stop shooting and start talking? Well, there's no rule set that says that you can't talk and shoot at the same time. And I would argue that BMPs rolling through Tbilisi with a search and traverse with their machine guns is a pretty big political statement.
It's a powerful negotiating tool.
It is, and it's certainly counter to current Western thinking. When, of course, Kerry gets on the Sunday news shows and starts talking about how the Russians in the Crimea and Ukraine are using 19th century rules in the 21st century, as if the rules have ever changed one iota. It's sort of a mistaken understanding of the context in which all this happens. It is also, the dynamic that is now making itself felt in Syria is the residue of Ukraine, and in some cases the residue of what's going on with pressure on the Baltic states. And that I think in March of last year, when Ukraine happened, or the Crimea was occupied by the little green men, the Russians pushed. And their biggest fear, I think, at the time was that we would push back, and we didn't. And I think you saw a couple of months where Lavrov and Shoigu and Putin sat down and said, okay, it's a different game. The Americans are not players in it. We need to expand our aperture a little bit. And that's when you saw the Russian decision to send air elements into Syria. That's when you saw significant beefing up of Russian forces in the Western Military District to stride the Baltic states, who are also NATO members, by the way, because they don't feel nearly as constrained by the United States as they once did. Without a theater nuclear weapon, without an intermediate range ballistic missile of our own, the Russians are monopolizing that particular envelope of deterrence.
That's true, but let's not put the Russians too high on a pedestal. They're operating out of a position of almost desperation. They don't have a lot of allies. They didn't go into Syria because they wanted to. They absolutely had to.
Well, that is true.
Is standing by their ally.
That is true. But I will tell you this: I don't think there's anything that is desperation about what Putin is doing. We had a lot of talk in a lot of circles, the war college included, after Crimea, that Putin had bit off more than he could chew, and it will be his death knell in Ukraine, and he's going to wind up being wildly unpopular at home and possibly be overthrown. Not a chance. And it's all relative. Is the Russian army of 2016 the Soviet masses of 1970? No, they're not. But neither is NATO the NATO of 1970. And proportionally, that balance has shifted greatly toward the Russians. And the land of the blind, the one-eyed man, and so forth. I don't know if you saw the article that came out in the Russian Sputnik magazine there, that they were talking about the Rand Corporation series of games that were done, that the best outcome that the Allies had against the Russians was about 60 hours worth of resistance before they overran the Baltic.
Yeah, that's troublesome. And we've noted since then that the U.S. has upped its deployments in partnership exercises up there. We're essentially putting a tripwire up there, where it's one thing to attack the Balkans, the Baltics. It's another thing to attack the Baltics and the Americans.
Yeah, that is true for now. And the problem you have with that is that that had been, I am sure, at the center of Putin's concerns in the Baltic and in Syria and now in Iraq. When he doesn't give us the consideration that we are probably due, that's when miscalculations happen. When he perceives our weakness and begins to move in accordance with that perception, if he isn't right, if he does cross a no-kidding tripwire, that's how wars start. And I don't know if he put it this way. I would tell you he hasn't guessed wrong yet. We have not been sufficiently forceful with him regarding our intentions for our NATO allies or our intentions in Europe. We don't understand them. We don't understand that what looks an awful lot like paranoia to us is simple prudence to the Russians. They have lived that even within living memory. They tell the tale, as Putin tells the tale, that NATO has encircled the Russians and they're trying to keep them down. Putin talks about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the catastrophic political event of the 20th century. From a Russian standpoint, that is not entirely wrong. Now, having said that, I don't think Putin is looking to reconstitute the Soviet Union. I don't believe he has any desire whatsoever to take on a bunch of moribund economies and suddenly become responsible for them when his own is in the dregs. That also said, a lot of the factors that we tend to attribute to the lessening of his power, the loosening of his grip, have not done so and will not do so. He is immensely popular. He has tremendous loyalty in the armed forces. He has a state secret police organization that is second to none, so that he will not have a whole bunch of dissident opinion when he acts strongly. And in some cases, had we tread that ground a little differently, he begged us in 2011 to enter into a partnership with him to fight ISIS, and we simply didn't do so. Had we thought a little bit harder about that, we might have. And we seem to still be flummoxed by Europe's reaction to him, which is one of both fear and in some cases resignation. It's instructive that after South Ossetia in Georgia, Merkel set the world speed record flying to St. Petersburg to meet with him because she understood that they had the oil card to play, the energy card to play in Central and Western Europe. And she also understood at a very visceral level that I don't think we do, that she and the Poles and the Romanians, the Bulgarians, and the Czechs and Slovaks, they have to share the continent with Russia. When the United States can retreat back behind its oceans, or at least we think we can, they're still neighbors. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if our foreign policy cabal has much of an understanding of that at all. I think we've badly misplayed handling of Russian interests in a lot of places. And in some cases, the hard part of this, XBrad, is that if you take a look at this empirically, can you really say that the Russians have acted unreasonably? The answer is no, they have not.
And that's one of the frustrating things is, in the post-1989 world, the collapse of the Soviet Union was so catastrophic, it was in the U.S. best interest to see a strong and healthy Russia. And a lot of their internal politics made that difficult. But we would want to see a strong, successful Russia. But our policy has been such a mishmash that it's just built it to this adversarial relationship. And obviously that's Putin's doing in many ways. But we also we're in a position where in the post-collapse era where we how do I say this? We lorded it over Russia. We almost forced this adversarial relationship on Russia, where we ignored their interests.
We did, and in some cases, I understand ignoring their interests because they were, in some cases, counter to ours. It was Condi Rice began to make her political bones with her series of essays at Stanford in the mid-'90s about how Russia, although their interests seem to coincide with ours at the moment, that's rather a mirage. They're not necessarily our enemies, but they're not necessarily our friends either. And that said, we did some things that I think were, had we understood what was really going on, and this, again, straddles both sides of the aisle. Bringing Poland into NATO was one that I wonder if we had a chance to do it again, if we had done it differently, some of the residual relationships would be different. I dealt with a number of Polish officers when I was at Camp Lejeune about 20 years ago. I was at working Partnership for Peace with the UMF Future Ops. Some of them were pretty concerned because they understood in a way that, again, that we did not, that a neutral Poland was good for everybody. When Poland became aligned with one side or the other, the side to which it was not aligned was very nervous. And that goes back millennia. And we didn't see, we were sort of a bull in the china shop with Poland. I think the cooler heads had prevailed. It became a NATO member, I want to say 97. So
96, 97, yeah.
Yeah, it was the Clinton administration that did it finally, but it was the George Herbert Walker Bush administration that got the ball rolling. I think we've done similar with a couple of other countries there, where it does seem like a poke in the eye. We kicked Russia while they were down. That's America's tendency to do that because we think history ended in 1991. In some cases, we haven't been particularly understanding of, which is not to say sympathetic to, understanding of the viewpoints of people like Russia or China. So, this boat, I think you're absolutely correct. This boat we're in with the Russians is as much our doing as it is Putin's. Now, Putin talks in very bombastic terms about how the Russians have been surrounded by Western aggression since the end of the Cold War. Not really. That's not really true. But from where they sit, that resonates with them. And he says that, whether he believes it or not, I don't know, but he says that for a purpose. And that purpose is pretty effective. And it didn't help us to have Victoria Nuland running around the Crimea in Ukraine in 2012 and 13, right in Putin's backyard, looking to upend a regime on its border that was quite friendly to Russia.
Yeah, very much so. All right, you're an artilleryman. Let's talk about Russian artillery in Ukraine. It has been stunningly effective. Every time the Ukrainians mass a battalion of armor to stage a counterattack against the little green men, they get hammered. And here's the thing about armor. You have to mass it to make an effective attack.
Mm-hmm.
But every time you mass, you make a very attractive target. And the Russians have been using conventional tube artillery and multiple launch rocket artillery to just slaughter, literally decimate armored battalions.
Yes.
How do you counter that?
How do you counter it? From where the Ukrainians sit, you may not be able to. The Russians are using observation means that they're not brand new, but they're new enough, and they're stealthy enough that the Ukrainians can't go get them. My guess is that they have got real-time satellite imagery in some cases. They're probably using high-altitude UAVs. They have got Russian observers on the ground who may or may not be wearing little green uniforms, who have the ability to digitally communicate locations. Modern artillery is a very, very frightful thing. I'm thinking of our own instances here where we seem to be de-emphasizing the role of firepower on a battlefield. I think the Russians have proved in Ukraine for certain that the next battlefield will be dominated by such firepower. Russian artillery is a long tradition beginning after the First World War, where they had been so badly handled by German artillery. It is their god of war. They are disciples of combined arms in a way that is very similar to the Marine Corps, where they have aviation as long-range fires. They have tube and rocket artillery. They are very heavy in mortars, 60 millimeter, 82 millimeter, 120 millimeter, even 160, even 240 millimeter mortars that are very mobile systems, can be used in a shoot and scoot. They've got extensive MLRS systems. The Smerch is a very effective weapon system. They've got the BM-21 rocket artillery. They also have enough where the precision of their firepower is not necessarily a requirement. They don't necessarily have the sensitivity to collateral damage and civilian casualties that we do. They certainly don't.
No.
Which opens up an envelope of speed of response and weight of fires that makes their fire support entities incredibly lethal.
Let me just first say, there's a reason why Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture features cannon.
Yes, absolutely.
And you're talking about their I don't want to say it's an utter disregard for collateral damage, but it's a cold calculation that collateral damage to civilians and infrastructure is entirely justified if you achieve the military objective. We want to destroy a Ukrainian armored battalion. Well, we have to flatten the roads to do it. Yes, but we killed the Ukrainian armored battalion.
Yeah, and that's that is far closer to the mean in the world than our rather highly restrictive rules of engagement, highly restrictive sensitivity to collateral damage. I'll tell you a quick sea story. I was in that 97 time frame, 98, working with Partnership for Peace people. We were walking through Combat Town with a group of Estonian and Latvian officers. And this sort of a facilitated discussion was the drill. And I remember saying, well, what would happen if you began to take sniper fire from that building? And, the Estonian major said I would bring my engineers in and we would level the building. And I said, what about civilians in a building? And he said, fortunes of war. I think our guys, and then there's everybody else, has been something that we have missed a little bit, and the Russians have foremost in their minds. And we used to too. I mean, it's an amazing figure. We killed 1/3 Frenchmen, civilians, liberating France.
Mm-hmm.
We bombed the rail yards in Cobra. We bombed French ports and shipyards with as accurate as we could get. It wasn't our intent to kill them, but we knew that was going to be a collateral effect. And we did it. And I don't think there would be any Frenchman that would tell you that it wasn't worth it if they'd lived under Nazi occupation. We seem to have begun to believe in some sanitized form of warfare that I think is probably much more an invention of a hopeful media and a rather disingenuous at times senior officer level.
I think a lot of it is the stunning success of Desert Storm in 1991, where the vast majority of the combat took place well away from civilian population centers and was very one-sided, has led to an unreal anticipation that we can conduct combat without collateral damage and that we're entirely capable of every shot being a precision shot. And that brings me to one of my pet peeves is the U.S. DOD has unilaterally decided to tell the Army and everybody else that you cannot use cluster munitions. We didn't sign the treaty.
Right.
But DoD has told the Army you can no longer use DPICM MLRS. And for the listener, that's dual purpose, improved conventional munitions for the multiple launch rocket system. Basically, it's bomblets that come out of the rocket launcher. And it is incredibly effective. The problem is you get about a 3% dud rate. Well, everybody worries about little kids picking up the duds and getting killed. And it's a genuine problem, but that's something we can mitigate. The problem is, if you get rid of DPICM, you suddenly lose the ability to kill a Russian armored battalion, or Iraqi, or Iranian, or who have you. We're surrendering our own best weapons.
Yeah, and that's
the theoretical possibility that we're going to kill a kid 10 years down the line.
Yeah, that's those whose lives depend on that fire support are pretty disturbed by that. We've also seen where there's been question about whether or not we could use in the DPICM also applies to 155 millimeter rounds. By the way, those are no longer going to be employed, from what I understand. The same is true of things like the fast-game munitions, the family of artillery scatterable mines, some other munitions that wind up being combat multipliers, landmines in and of their own right that are the ability to canalize an enemy, to increase defenses, to make defensive positions more formidable. Without those, it becomes a numbers game, and of course, we are at the wrong end of almost every numbers game that we would come across.
And this is not something that was debated by Congress and the law was passed. It's the Secretary of Defense wrote a memo.
Yeah, and the disappointment I have is that there's not anybody in a uniform that would tell the Secretary of Defense, you need to tear this memo up, put it in a shredder. Otherwise, I'm going to very publicly resign, and this will be the cause, and I will make it known that this is the cause, that you are willing to gamble American lives on the off chance that there could be a harm to an innocent. We don't have any of that. We haven't had any of that, and I'm disappointed in that, because those are not theoretical, esoteric concepts. When you begin to work in a targeting cell, you begin to work as a fire supporter. The ability of available munitions, the ability of available terrain denial weapons, factor into your combat power. We are already on the wrong side of a great deal of the combat ratios. We are looking at our technical advantage to mitigate that to a great extent, but some of that technical advantage would have been in years past an AV-8 coming over with a belly pod full of fast game or belly pod full of cluster munitions and dumping them on a runway, dumping them on an avenue of approach, dumping them on a column of armored vehicles that happen to be in the open. Without the ability to shoot rockets at that or tube artillery at that and do the same thing, we have very few ways to kill that column of tanks, other than having our own column of tanks, which we don't necessarily have.
And I will tell you, I have seen the MLRS go out and smite my enemy. I have seen the effects of B-52 dropping a full load of CDU on an enemy armor brigade. It works.
It absolutely does.
It's a hell of a lot easier when we have to go in and clean up afterwards to have that work first.
Yeah, absolutely, and those are the lives of Lance Corporals that you'll hear me talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's willing to bet the life of somebody's son on this, incredibly naive, misguided notion that showing our throat to the wolves is the honorable thing to do, even though we get a bunch of us killed because in the off chance that we wind up having somebody innocent be killed in the crossfire, will damn us in the eyes of the world forever and ever. It has never been like that, and I would submit to the world in general that if we had political and military leadership with the guts to stand up and say, look, bad things happen in war. We do not intentionally target civilians. We hope that no innocents are killed, but by the act committed by our adversaries to engage us in this war, there may be. I'm going to give the American forces at my disposal all of the support they can possibly have to destroy our enemies as quickly as possible and bring as many warm, beating American hearts home as I can, and I will deal with the consequences. We don't have anybody that seems to have the courage to say that. And ironically, the closest that I heard that in recent decades was Donald Rumsfeld's admonition that, hey, when you're getting a shot at, it is never wrong to shoot back. But I haven't heard anything approaching that since, and that is somewhat disturbing. As having driven through places like Ramadi and Fallujah and Qaim and Baghdadi, those are not fun places if your rules of engagement restrict you to shooting second or to having to be somewhat passive with what is your trump card of your combat capability, while the other team gets to essentially kill you as many ways as they can possibly think of. In a counterinsurgency environment, yes, people get killed. In a major combat operations environment, you lose battles and wars with that philosophy.
Yeah, it's very frustrating that we got this mindset that we have to overanalyze every combat engagement. You know what? People shoot at each other. It happens all the time. And there seems to be no common sense in our rules of engagement. We can't just say, okay, look, we trust the average commander to understand that we want him to achieve a military objective, and we also want him to avoid doing unnecessary damage or causing unnecessary death. We can't do that. No, we have to write it out and codify and run it by the JAG on the theoretical possibility that there's some interpretation of the Geneva Conventions that he might be committing a war crime.
Yeah, and it's we're also positively genuflecting to this and somewhat contrived public opinion that says that the enemy can do whatever it wants, and if we make one mistake, we're the bad guys. This idea, and this is something that I think I don't know if you'll agree with it or not, but it certainly has run counter to the opinions of people that I've worked with. The idea of the strategic corporal is brought about by general officers and politicians who lack the courage to do what they're supposed to. You put that corporal out there, that corporal's out there. You are responsible for what he does as much as he is. And you need to have the courage to stand up and say to a reporter in front of a microphone, or the American people, or your seniors, or a congressional committee, that you put him out there, he acted as he needed to act. If unfortunate things happen and he made a bad call, too bad, so sad. That is the responsibility of the people that sent us into that place to do this job. It is not the responsibility of the corporal or the commander on the ground who is supposed to try and figure out how to make the corporal do exactly as he's supposed to do when he's got green traces slapping the wall behind him. We haven't done that. It was your mention of Desert Storm is a good one. There was a great article a couple of days ago about how Desert Storm was the sort of that beginning of the idea of an antiseptic war. You might have seen it. It might have been on War on the Rocks.
I think it was.
It was it? Okay, it's a super article. I passed that around the War College community there a little bit because they thought it was a particularly good article.
You could not design a theater of operations to better showcase the military operating well and causing as few civilian casualties. I mean, no terrain, no people. It was a perfect shooting gallery. But that's not how the world usually works. And everybody watched what happened in Desert Storm, and everybody changed how they fight.
Yep.
Except
They
us.
sure did.
Except us.
Well, that's right. And one of the effects of it, or two effects that are of note. The first is that the Chinese looked at it and did some very spirited internal debate and produced a paper called Unrestricted Warfare by a couple of staff college colonels. And I think it was 98 or 99. It was published, which essentially said we are not going to try and defeat the Americans technology for technology on a battlefield. We are going to look at an entire spectrum, which includes economic and particularly cyber. And I would submit to you that Chinese cyber capabilities were born with that discussion and have followed that roadmap very, very, very faithfully. One of the other of our adversaries saw that and immediately hired a great deal of European mining firms to go and dig tunnels, and that was the North Koreans. The NKPA is dug into its caves, and it has its clamshell blast doors because of Desert Storm, which now, instead of precision munitions being a wonderful thing that are a combat multiplier and a decisive factor, now they are positively required to have any effect whatsoever on the NKPA early in a fight. And there are a number of other places that took a look at the A2AD, the anti-access area denial evolution in the world's littorals can be traced to American dominance on the Desert Storm battlefields.
It is utterly ironic that a war in the desert gave birth to the modern People's Liberation Army Navy.
Yes, isn't it though? Yeah. And those are, we tend to use the term asymmetry. Those are asymmetric weapons, and that a number of missile batteries tied to search and acquisition radars hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away, can negate what had been the greatest Navy in the world to a certain extent. So it's they invested in, and I would tell you that with current evaluation, I would say that they invested wisely.
All right. Well, I think we got to wrap this up. We're running into about 90 minutes here. Any last thoughts?
I appreciate the opportunity for this. This is always fun to discuss such a thing with somebody who pays such close attention and has such learned opinions on the subjects. I will keep an eye on Syria. I will keep an eye on the Russians and the Turks. The one thing I think we'll find out is whether or not, if the Turks invoke Article 5, whether or not Article 5 comes to play, will that be the end of NATO as we know it? If they don't, in some cases, take up the Turkish cause, what will that say about future Article 5s? And what would it say about a future event in the Baltic states where it may indeed be a Russian incursion? But
I'm going to make a prediction. Turkey won't go Article 5. They'll make a direct appeal for aid because they know most of NATO will not stand by Article 5, but some will come for a direct appeal to aid.
That may be the case. It may be that Erdogan has cooler heads. He was pushing for Article 5 through back channels when the aircraft was shot down.
Mm-hmm.
He may have gotten his lunch after that. So it may indeed be that, Brad, that you're correct. He doesn't go the Article 5 route. As for Scalia, I hope that the loss of his voice is not the loss of the constitutional focus of the Supreme Court. I am very, very suspicious of activists from either side, frankly, who would take the Supreme Court as a body in which they can further their cause. It is supposed to be the independent arbiter in the separation of powers, whether or not the actions of the government are in keeping with the Constitution, either with the President or the Congress. And to have that body become blatantly partisan may do damage beyond repair that this republic will never quite be what it was. And that would be a tragedy for future generations.
Concur. All right. This has been Ultima Ratio Regis and XBradTC. And we'll catch you guys later.
All right. Take care.